Folks, thanks. We're back. Again, I have Tim Connick from the Deer Breeder Corporation here. My name is Patrick Charlton from TDA, and we have Chris Cerny from permitting over at Parks and Wildlife. Chris is a well-known commodity around the industry. Y'all have all dealt with Chris at one form or fashion throughout his tenure at Parks and Wildlife. He's kind enough to come over to assist us in some permitting update, but specifically focusing on the georeferencing component of the new regulations. First and foremost, for people that are on, if you get in a bind, if you can't hear, if you have to drop off for any reason, know that we are going to, we are recording this, and our plan is to put this out on the Texas Deer Association and Deer Breeder Corporation websites. And if Parks and Wildlife sees fit, they may share it out as well. So what our goal here is to make sure that if you happen to drop off or you have to go for some reason, know that we'll get it up just as soon as possible on our websites for everybody to be able to review later. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chris Cerny. He's going to go through a PowerPoint. If you are on a cell phone, obviously, unless you have the GoToWebinar app, you will not be able to view the PowerPoint. So he'll walk through it and explain as much as we can in detail on it. If you are at a computer, you're able to view it, and you will also be able to ask questions. Feel free to ask as many questions as you can. We'll get to them at the end if we don't already cover them throughout the webinar. So with that, Chris, why don't you take it away?
All righty, thank you, Patrick, and thanks everybody for joining today. And please do let us know if you're having trouble hearing us or if something's not working right. What I'll do right now is start off with this brief PowerPoint that we have, because the real focus for the day today is to do a live demonstration of the georeferencing capabilities that we've incorporated into TWIMS. And so we want to spend most of our time there, but I think there's probably some questions. Sorry, real quick, we just had a little message pop up. Hang on one second. So one thing I know that folks are familiar with is that there have been a couple of recently adopted regulations. So before we dive into the georeferencing demonstration, I do just want to briefly cover for folks a couple of important updates that were recently adopted by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission. And the first one to cover is related to soft release provisions. Soft release is currently authorized where release sites that are taking deer can hold those deer in a temporary holding pen for up to 30 days per the original rules. And there's a recently adopted regulation change that says that soft release will now be available only from March 1 until the 10-day antler cutoff goes in, sometime in mid-September every year, depending on when hunting season starts. So the first change is you used to be able to request soft release at any time of year. But again, that soft release period was only for 30 days that you could hold those deer. So what we've done is now said that you can only apply for soft release during a certain period of time, again, when deer season is not open, so March 1 until that 10-day cutoff. But once deer are sent to a soft release pen, they can stay in that pen from the time they enter it, anytime after March 1, until the 10-day cutoff takes effect. So deer can now stay in the soft release pen for potentially several months, whereas prior the period was only 30 days. So the only other thing to know about this is, just like current process, you do need to submit a soft release request form prior to transferring deer to that release site and putting them in that pen. And we'll talk about during the georeferencing what it looks like to map a soft release site, or to map a release site that uses a soft release pen. We'll talk about release sites that have setups where there may be a smaller pen within a larger release site. So we'll cover a lot of this again during the georeferencing portion of this demonstration, but do be aware, again, just in summary for soft release, that you can apply for soft release anytime between March 1 and the 10-day cutoff. And once those deer enter that soft release pen, they can stay there for that entire period of time. No 30-day window anymore. And that takes effect immediately, essentially. So if you actually have deer in a soft release pen right now, they can stay in that pen until the 10-day cutoff. And then certainly if you submit a soft release request form here in the next few weeks or months, those deer will be able to stay in for that entire period of time. And this will be in place for next season as well. The next update to give you about recently adopted regulations deals with regaining movement qualification. This only applies to a handful of facilities where there is not a sufficient number of deer in the pens to do substitution testing, antemortem testing, to substitute for missed mortalities or for the minimum number of required tests based on the standard movement qualification rules. So some folks have found themselves in a situation where they just simply did not have enough deer in the pens to regain movement qualification. And so the regulation that was just adopted by the commission does provide an option to those facilities to conduct a initial round of antemortem testing for 100% of the eligible age deer in the pen, and then with a follow-up 1 year later of 100% of the eligible age deer in the pen. This provision really does apply to a specific few facilities out there. This is not one that most folks will find themselves needing to worry about. But if you are in that situation of trying to regain movement qualification, what I'd encourage you to do is contact the permits office directly, because your scenario will be unique and you'll want to discuss how this rule applies to your facility with them. There is a provision regarding when you can begin conducting that antemortem testing that's important. So if you find yourself in this position, please don't just immediately jump out and start pulling samples. Please do contact the permits office staff and make sure that you get this set up properly for your scenario. And those are really the two big recent updates regarding new regulations, aside from, of course, the one we're really here to talk about, which is the georeferencing. Yes, sir.
Hey, Chris, on the soft release provisions, I want to make sure that it was clear to everyone that you can release the deer at any time after 30 days.
Correct, even prior to 30 days. So if you want to use a soft release pen for only a couple weeks or a couple days, that's perfectly fine. The primary focus of this update does not say that they must stay in there for any period of time. It just extends the period for which they can stay in the pens. But
I just want to make sure you got that clear too.
Yeah, good clarification. I appreciate that, Tim. All right, so before we dive into the georeferencing demonstration, which will actually be a live demonstration in TWIMS, I do want to just run down a couple of important dates that are coming up this spring. So first of all, March 31st, here in just a couple of days, we have, as I'm sure everybody on the line is well aware, and hopefully most folks are well in front of, your fawn tagging deadline for all 2018 born fawns is approaching this March 31st, which is Sunday. So if you've got some fawns that have not yet been tagged with their alphanumeric unique number written on that tag, it's time to get in the pens and hustle. The other important deadline coming on March 31st is for Class 2 and 3 release sites. If you are a Class 2 or 3 release site, your harvest log for the 2018-19 hunting season is due by this Sunday, and that's in TWIMS that you enter all that information. So you log into TWIMS, you click on the deer inventory lookup page, you look for your release site, and you look for the harvest log, and you enter all of your annual harvest for this deer season there. That needs to be submitted by this Sunday, March 31st. Now, your CWD tests for your Class 2 or 3 release site are not necessarily due as of March 31. We'll cover that in a second, but you do need to go ahead and submit and complete the harvest log stating exactly what was harvested for this past deer season that just wrapped up. So those are the two important updates for March 31. We do have some important deadlines that come in the day following, and I know this is not the primary focus of this, but I figure it's a good option or good opportunity to remind folks who participate in MLD that if you have not done so, we do need you to go ahead and also submit your MLD report, your harvest report there as well. And that's a simple summary of how many bucks and how many does were harvested for the season. That's done through the Land Management Assistance website. So not through TWIMS Deer Breeder, but through the LMA website. If you are participating in MLD or you did participate for 2018 and 19, please make sure that you've submitted your harvest report. And if you participate in conservation option, your habitat practices that were completed during the last season as well. Another important due date on April 1, or actually not a due date, but just an important bit of functionality becoming available for deer breeders, for those permitted deer breeding facilities. Your annual reports will become available on Monday. So if you were to log in right now, you will not see the option to begin your annual report. That will become available on Monday, April 1, and you'll have until May 15th to complete that annual report. And we'll talk more about that because the georeferencing does play into completing your annual report for deer breeding facilities this year. So we'll go over that a bit more in detail once we start into our demo. Last thing on April 1, of course, is what we're here to talk about today primarily, which is the georeferenced map requirement. This one really on April 1 impacts primarily destination sites that are not deer breeding facilities. So release sites nursing facilities, and the handful of other non-breeder facility types out there. So the way the regulation is being implemented, if you have a release site right now, you can continue to move deer up until April 1 with no problem, regardless of whether you have a map on file. But as of April 1, any release site, nursing facility, the handful of medical facilities, or one or two other non-breeder facility types out there, if you do not have your georeferenced map on file and processed in TWIMS, meaning that permits office staff has reviewed it and gone ahead and placed it permanently on file for that site, then your release site or nursing facility will not be eligible to receive deer until such time as that map is on file. So a couple points on this, folks. If you don't plan to receive deer at a release site or a nursing facility in the next few weeks, there is no big rush for you to jump into TWIMS right now and put that map on file. Nothing happens on April 1 if the map's not on file, other than a transfer permit can't be activated to that site. So I don't want folks to be out there in a panic thinking that, oh man, I've got a lot going on between now and April 1, and if I don't get this done, something bad happens. That is not the case. It's just that, again, no transfer permit will be able to be activated to those specific site types until that map is on file. Now, for those of you who have a deer breeder's permit, your facility on April 1 and after will be able to continue moving deer regardless of whether you have your map on file just yet. And that plays into the availability of your annual report. You will, as you complete your annual report this year, be required to put a map on file if one is not already on file for your facility. So a lot of y'all have already jumped in and put a map on file showing where the breeder pens are, and that's great. And we appreciate you getting that done early. That's one less thing you have to do during your annual report. But if you have not gotten that done yet, don't feel pressured that this has to happen by April 1. Again, you have from April 1 to May 15th to complete your annual report. And as part of that annual report requirement this year, you will put the map on file at that time if you haven't already done so. And so really for you, the deadline is that May 15th annual report that is always in place for us. And there's just one extra step now, which is to put that map on file if it's not already there. So again, just a brief summary on what April 1 means. If you are a release site and you don't plan to receive deer in the next few weeks, April 1 is not a hugely important deadline for you. You've got time to get in when you want and put your map on file. So let's say that you plan to do fall release primarily, and you don't plan to take deer until late August or September. You have until that time essentially to get your map on file. But if you do know that you have some spring release coming up, that you plan to move some bred does in the next few weeks, you really do want to get in now and get that map approved and on file. So I hope that helps clarify exactly what it means for this April 1 deadline for georeferenced maps. And please do submit any questions if you have any to follow up on that. Okay, so our next important date is May 1. Now, this date only applies to Class 2 and 3 release sites, but that is the date by which you do need to submit all CWD tests that were collected from harvest on that release site during the 2018 and 19 season. So again, this coming March 31, this Sunday, is the deadline to submit your harvest log. And then by May 1, you need to add all of your CWD test results to that harvest log to be in compliance for this season. And after that, our next and final important date for this spring is May 15th, which, as we just discussed, is the annual report deadline or the annual deadline for deer breeder permits, annual reports, and renewals. And keep in mind, even if you have a multi-year permit, many folks out there have a deer breeder permit that's valid for 3 or 5 years, you still have an annual report requirement. You do need to go in and reconcile your inventory, update your facility information, including the map if that's not on file, review all the other information related to your permit. So you don't have a permit renewal to do if you have a multi-year permit, but you do have an annual report that needs to be filed. So please don't overlook this, but again, that becomes available April 1. You have 6 weeks until May 15th to complete that process. So folks, that's essentially the PowerPoint presentation that we're going to do. And so we've got, at this point, a live demonstration that we're going to do to show how the georeferencing works in TWIMS. And so from here, we're actually going to go ahead and leave from the PowerPoint. We'll come back, and I'm going to put at the end of this, what we'll do when it's time to start answering questions is we'll put that slide back up that has all the dates on it so that that can be there for a reference. But for now, we're going to go ahead and jump over and begin doing a PowerPoint, or I'm sorry, a live demonstration in TWIMS of how georeferencing works. And Patrick's going to help me get set up there. So bear with us just a second.
We need to go into TWIMS.
Yeah, if you'll just start any internet browser for me, please.
Got it. What is it?
If you go to Google, please, and just search TWIMS. That'll be our first result.
Here we go. We're going to show Google Chrome.
Okay, and so hopefully folks are seeing the internet browser here. If you're not, please let us know. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out now, and this is an important change, is because all release sites, and really this is one thing that I should have discussed when we were talking about the April 1 deadline. For existing release sites, that April 1 deadline is the case. You can continue to move deer now, between now and April 1 without a map on file. But if you're a new release site that needs to be registered, or especially if you're a deer breeder who has a customer that needs to register a new release site, that as of now does require a map to be put on file before that site gets a facility ID. And so prior to launching this new functionality last week, deer breeders could go in and register a release site for a customer at any time and immediately receive a facility ID after they put the essential information on file that included who's the customer who owns the site, what's the basic facility information. You would submit that and immediately be returned a facility ID to activate a transfer permit. That process for new release sites has changed. You deer breeder permit holders out there with access to TWIMS do still have the option to help folks register a release site. You will be asked to put a map on file. So if you're going to help your customers register a release site, you'll want to ask them for all of the same information you've traditionally requested and ask them to provide you with a map. Folks can go into Google Earth, which is a free program most folks are familiar with these days, and you can draw a polygon, a boundary of your property, and save that as a KML file. That's an option that you can do within Google Earth right now for free. And if you ask your customer to just send you that KML file, then you can go ahead and upload that for them. Alternatively, you can direct your customer. If that sounds like something that you really don't want to take on, you think that might be a confusing process, what we now have available that was not available prior is the ability for a customer to apply for a release site themselves from the main TWIMS page without logging into the system. So I want y'all to be aware that you can send your folks to the TWIMS homepage and ask them, if you've got a planned release coming up in the next few weeks, you've begun discussions with the customer, ask them to go ahead and submit this release site application at their convenience, but as soon as possible. What happens when they complete this application, it goes in for our permits office staff to review and process. And right now, we're making these new release sites a priority and turning those around at most within 3 to 5 business days. But right now, I'll tell you, we've been much more close to 1 to 2 business day turnaround. And so we are prioritizing getting those new release sites processed and get a facility ID out there. So do be aware that you can still help your customers register a release site. But if you want to, you can now send them directly to TWIMS and they can do that process themselves. Okay. So all they do is open up that permit program information and application section, and they will see the release site application button there, and they can click to start that. We won't run all the way through this, but essentially they provide all that same information that you would already be providing. Who is the customer? And then they'll continue on to facility information. They'll draw the map of the boundary if they want to draw it within TWIMS, or they can upload a file. They submit that, and within a couple business days at most, no more than 3 to 5, we will have a facility ID that you guys can use to activate a transfer permit. Now, what's really been the primary focus, and I believe for most folks who are listening in right now, the primary focus I think that folks are placing on TWIMS right now are for existing sites. And so that's really what I want to demonstrate for us as we go through this is what does it take to use the mapping capabilities within TWIMS to get a map on file for your release site or your deer breeding facility that you already have registered, already have a facility ID for. And so that's what we're going to go in and demonstrate here right now. And so I keep some test accounts available, and that's what we're going to look at is how do we do this for our existing site. see if I can remember my password. Okay. So most folks should be familiar with this screen here, your main screen, and of course you'll go behind the deer breeder permits and herd tracking option, and you'll have a look at your facility page. So if you are a release site owner, or if you're helping somebody who has a release site that's already registered, when they get to their facility page, they have a facility ID. Now all you do is click like you would normally click to go look at your facility information. Open up this facility information page. It looks mostly like normal up top, shows you all the information about the facility name, the basic information about where it's located. The new feature, of course, is that there's now a map available. And that map is present directly on the facility information page, and it will open up to default to a view of the county where that facility is registered. So my site is basically registered to be TPWD headquarters in Travis County. And so what we see is the map is centered to look at Travis County. It defaults to show you satellite imagery, and we want you to use the satellite imagery to map your property so that you can identify your fence lines. But if you're kind of unfamiliar with locating your property on aerial imagery, please note that you do have the option to switch between aerial imagery and a street map layer. And so if you want to start locating your property by using this street map to help you kind of locate where you're at, that's certainly an option for you. And so you just click on the map and hold it to drag it around until you start to get your area centered. And I'll back up real quick. I immediately dove into what we're seeing on the map. And the most important thing I want you to know is what we're not seeing. What we don't see yet is a boundary on here. So if you have already had your facility mapped and it has already been processed by TPWD staff, you will immediately see your boundary on this page. So one thing to note is that I know I need to draw a map here because I don't see this boundary and I don't see a pending map, which I'll show you what it looks like once you submit your map and it has not yet been processed. But because I don't have a pending map notice here, and because I don't see a map on screen, I know I need to draw this. And so what we're going to do is locate where our release site is at on the map. And so again, I'm just going to show you here as I navigate around. Where's my scroll bar? Oops. Pardon me, guys. I'm on a Mac, and that's not my native device here. What am I doing wrong, Patrick?
Just trying to scroll.
Well, I wanted to scroll back up on the main page here. Look at me. I need help, guys. There we go. So what I want to show you is that this release site is located east of Austin. You know, basically we put it at headquarters just for testing purposes. So I'm going to kind of move to the east side of Austin, and I'm looking for this area here. There we go. And so what you can do is you start zooming in on your location. You use these plus or minus bars or buttons in the upper left of the map to begin zooming in. You've got this map help guide out here that describes what all the different buttons do. And what we do is we start locating our area. And so TPWD headquarters is here by McKinney Falls State Park. And so now I know that I'm in my general area where our test release site is located, and I want to switch back to an imagery view. And so you can put it on either of these two options for imagery. We have two different flavors available. Doesn't matter which one you use, take your preference. And you continue zooming in until you can easily identify your site. And this is the TPWD headquarters complex. So this is what I'm going to go ahead and map here. I don't know why I'm so bad at this. Just scrolling up. I'm going to scroll back up to show what my facility acreage is. Got it. I'll learn here. So guys, what I did was when this site was originally registered, which all of you will have a number here, it was placed on file as being 10 acres. Okay. And so the map is going to calculate its acreage as you draw it. So when we start drawing here and we close in our boundary, it's going to calculate the mapped acreage. We do not expect perfection. There is no expectation that if you said your release site is 1,500 acres, that you draw exactly 1,500.00 acres on the map. What we did was we allow a tolerance of 15% plus or minus from what your stated acreage is as compared to what is mapped on the screen. Understanding that you may not hit every fence corner exactly perfectly. And again, we're not expecting perfection here. So all we're looking for is that you get your release site mapped as best as you can within that tolerance. Now, if that stated acreage is no longer correct, If you know for a fact that when you log in and you see that your stated acreage that you put on file when you first registered your site is no longer accurate, maybe you bought property next door, maybe you sold off a chunk of property and therefore you've got less acreage now, you will have to update the acreage that is stated here, because the program will not let you move forward if you draw a map that it has a calculated acreage outside of that 15% plus or minus tolerance. So in that scenario, if this applies to you where you know from the very get-go that this facility acreage for your release site is not accurate, go ahead and update it to be correct and draw your map to be correct for where those deer are being released. And then once you're done, we'll talk about what we want you to do, which is simply send an update separately to the permits office. And we'll give that address to send that to here in a second. But once you're ready, once you've located your spot, if you don't have a file available, you can use the drawing tools that are here within the map viewer. And so this triangle tool, you click this one to start drawing a new boundary. And so once you click on it, it gives you crosshairs, and you start at a corner of the property and you just click everywhere you want to drop a point. And you start working your way along the boundary of your property. And you continue dropping points as you make bends in the fence line. And you start working your way around until you come all the way back to where you started. And when you've completely moved around the entirety of the property, you click on that first point and it will close in your shape, and it'll immediately provide you with the calculated acreage. So in this case, we came within a very small bit of our 10 acres. This would be accepted no problem by this program because this is well within that 15% tolerance. So if you have your acreage stated at 10 acres and you wind up drawing 11, don't worry about needing to correct that 1 acreage difference. Go ahead and submit that. What we're really looking at is when you have those large discrepancies that are more than plus or minus 15%. Now let's say that while I was doing this, I recognize I made an error and that I need to correct that I got a fence corner wrong. Before you submit this information, you have the opportunity to edit it. And so using the map help guide, you'll see that this wrench shaped icon, if you click on that, it will allow you to edit your boundary. So what you do is you click that button and it immediately shows you all those points that you dropped, and you can start dragging those around. So if I recognize that I got that corner off a little bit and I needed to move it up, I could do that. And so you click on it, you hold it, and then you move it to where it needs to go. These smaller buttons, or these smaller points, I should say, in between the main points that you drop can also be used if you want to add a new point. Maybe you need to drag a corner out a little bit or drag a straight point out to a corner. You can go ahead and do that. And so once you're done, you click save. It recalculates your area based on the edits you're making, and you move on. And so the only other option to point out, if you need it, is if you really have a boundary that you drew and you just don't like, it's really messed up and you want to start over, there is a tool here that will allow you to go ahead and erase. And so you can click on this kind of eraser shaped icon at the bottom here and click on your boundary, and it will completely get rid of that boundary. Just know that once you do that, there's no getting it back. So I would only use that one sparingly, and if you really feel like you've got a shape that you just can't fix. So since I did that, I'll just quickly redraw. And this is the backyard, essentially, of TPWD headquarters that I'm drawing here. I've got my 8.63 acres that I drew that time, so I may need to adjust that a little bit because I know that I actually should be pulling in that little bit of acreage right there. Save it. It zoomed in on me a little bit, so we'll back out. I'm good to go. If this is indeed my site, and the important thing to note here, folks, is we're asking you to map the specific acreage where those deer are being released. So this should be the specific high fenced pasture that you have registered as a release site where those deer have access to 100% of that registered acreage. Once you're done with that and you are satisfied with the map that you have on file, and we'll come back and we'll look at the opportunity to upload, but whether you've uploaded or drawn your map, once you have it satisfactorily in place, you scroll down to the bottom of the screen and you hit submit. If there are any errors, it will flag those. So for example, if you have an acreage error where you've got too great of a discrepancy between the mapped acreage and the stated acreage, it will stay on that page and it will tell you that there's too much of a difference. So if you don't come to this facility confirmation page, if when you click submit, you stay on that page, then you know that you've got something you need to address, and it'll give you an error message at the top of the page. If you're successful like we just were there, then it'll give you a note saying that your update has been submitted and it's pending review by TPWD staff. One very important point of this message to note is that it says if you submitted your new map, it will not be displayed until it has been reviewed and approved by TPWD. So let's have a look at what that looks like. This is something we've gotten a number of calls on is, hey, I just submitted my map and I don't see it. So now we're back to our main TWIMS facility page. We go back into the site that we just drew our map for. And again, we don't see it showing up just yet because it has not been reviewed by TPWD staff. However, please notice that when we first started, we did not have this button here that says view pending map. Once you have put a map on file, you will have that button available and you can click it to see what you submitted. So this map here will be displayed for you and you can confirm what you submitted. Okay, so you can't change it once it's been submitted. If you recognize that it's a problem and you made a mistake, you can go ahead and resubmit a map immediately. But again, if you see either your map approved or you see that there's an option to view a pending map, that means you have something either already on file or about to be reviewed. So don't worry if you don't immediately see your map show up after you submit it. Just look for this button to view your pending map. Okay? That is the vast majority of what folks are trying to do right now. And that really is all you have to do. The only other thing I would say that folks should be aware of is you can upload a KML file. Now I'm on a different computer. I don't have any KML files ready to go to demo what you would do here, but let's say that you have already drawn your boundary, a property map of your boundary for some other reason, perhaps for participation in MLD, you have a file handy, or you can even go into the LMA system and download a copy of your map and save out the appropriate management unit, the KML for that file. If you have that file saved on your computer, and it does need to be a KML file, you can upload that by just clicking on this file browse button and going and locating that particular KML file. And then it'll immediately display it on the screen as if you had mapped it yourself within the program. You can click to edit it if it needs some minor corrections. It's fully functional. It's just an option available to you if you know you already have a map file available. So that's really it, guys. That's what it looks like to map a release site. At this point, we would be done with what we needed to do. TPWD staff will review this. They'll go ahead and approve it if everything looks right, and you'll get an email notification to let you know once that's done. And at that time, as of right now, your facility is still eligible to activate a transfer permit. If it's after April 1 and your facility has been set to not movement qualified because we don't have a map yet, staff will be reviewing that map, and as they approve that map, they'll return the facility to movement qualified so that you can go ahead and activate transfer permits at that time.
So, Chris, I'm going to state the obvious. To preempt you from becoming non-movement qualified between now and April 1st, if you have an associated release site, now might be a real good time for you to start drawing the map, getting acclimated with the system, and
Absolutely.
If you're planning on selling deer to a particular customer, ensuring those customers have already drawn the map, their release site's ready to go. If they need help, they can always call permit staff or watch the webinar. They'll be ready to go. But I think the big takeaway from what you just said is don't wait till March 31st. Let's go ahead and do it right now.
If you know you've got a transfer coming up, that is exactly right. But again, if you aren't moving deer until the fall, then you will be back to movement qualified as soon as you put your map on file. And so you'll have plenty of time. If you know that you have fall release coming up and no spring release, you're not in a big hurry, but we do want you to get in and get this done sooner than later. But absolutely, to that point, if you plan to move deer in early April, you should be getting in and putting your map on file now.
I know Tim's got this question a lot, and I have to. Can you walk through a release site and a release site? Do we draw two separate TWIMS diagrams using the illustrator, or how do we do that?
Absolutely. So this is a good question, and this is one that kind of is going to cross back and forth between soft release pins and then registered release sites. And so we'll have to kind of touch on both of these. So let's say that this 10-acre facility that I registered was actually contained within a much larger pasture, potentially 1,000-acre pasture that's high fenced. The question is, how are we using this pin and how is it registered? If your intent is to use that small pin as a soft release pin, you do not need to map that. You do not need to register it as with its own facility ID. Soft release pins are given authority to hold deer by submitting that form that we discussed that you need to submit to permit staff, which they review and approve, and then they forward that to local law enforcement so that those folks are aware that, hey, if we find deer in a small pen, on this larger release site, we know why they're there. They're there for soft release.
And I hate to interrupt you on that point, but is there a mapping requirement for soft release in the new form system?
When you submit the form, it's the same paper form we've been using. You do have to draw a diagram of the pen that says where's feed, where's water, because it is a small captive pen, right? So we need to know that those deer are cared for. So you do draw a diagram outlining the shape of the pen, and you show where on the release site it is generally, but that's done with that paper form. All we're asking that you map here is the larger release site. In that case, if what you're using that 10-acre pen for is specifically a soft release pen where you only intend to hold those deer for the period of that soft release provision. Now, I know that's not necessarily the case for everybody. Some folks, for example, may have a 10-acre pen inside of or let's say a 50-acre pen inside of a 500-acre pen, and they do specific release in that 50-acre pen for a reason. It's not meant to be a soft release pen. Those two release sites are separate from one another and should be registered separately, therefore. So what you'll do in that scenario, if you haven't already done this, is you will go ahead and map whichever site is already registered. So let's say you have that scenario right now. And potentially I'm imagining there's a few folks listening who this might apply to, where you have already had a release site on file that's your 50-acre site, and it's surrounded maybe by a 500-acre pasture. You've maybe never registered that 500-acre high fence site. You've only got the 50-acre site registered. We're going to ask that you do two things in this case. The first is to go in and map your 50-acre site and put the map on file for that specific pasture. Again, we want you to map the acreage that is specifically on file for that registered release site. Then if you have not already done so, what you need to do is go and apply for a new release site for that other acreage, and you would map that specific acreage.
Which they can do right through the home screen of TWIMS now. Correct?
That's right. They can do it through the home screen, or if you already have a TWIMS login, which I have here, right? I'm logged in as just a release site owner. I can come down here, and there's an option for facility search and to register a new non-breeder facility. And so I just have to search by my last name and my driver's license number that's on file to associate that site with me. Or if you do it through the homepage, that's fine as well. It'll get associated with you at that point, but you do need to register that second release site if it's not already done so. Now, if you've already registered both of those, so say you already have a release site ID for the 50 acres, and you already have a release site ID for the 500 acres, you're going to go and submit two different maps, one for each release site. But the important point here is that it's always a one-to-one relationship here with release sites to facility IDs and maps. So if you have a facility ID for a release site, there should be a single boundary that represents the acreage of that release site. And if there is a release site within a release site, and those both need to be registered because of how that property is being managed, then we need to have two release sites, one specific to each acreage. But again, when we talk about soft release, and I know this introduces a little bit of confusion, if you intend to only temporarily hold deer in a soft release pen for that short period of time, up till now 30 days, but now moving forward a much longer period of time, several months potentially, you actually don't need to get a facility ID for the soft release. It's understood that that is a temporary holding location within the larger release site. You register the primary release site, the 1,000 acres, for example. You submit a form that's available on the permits program, the Deer Breeder Program information page. You can go download that right now, and we'll look at that in a second. You fill out that form that describes the soft release. It basically says where the deer are coming from, what's the release site they're ultimately heading to, and then you provide information about the soft release pen itself. And in that case, you only need the one release site ID. It's for the primary release site, knowing that the soft release is being used in that temporary holding capacity, and those deer will be out on that main release site in short order within that few month period. So kind of a bit going on there, and I hope that helps, and I'm glad to answer questions.
Is there any way that you can do an example on there of what you're talking about?
Sure.
Because I've got people that already have two release sites, one small one inside a large one, and they can't seem to get the small one mapped out. Is there a way you can show them how to do that right there?
So let's do that. And so this was just to show, for example, what a customer who has just a release site sees when they log in. So the next thing we were going to do is demo what happens when you're a deer breeder or somebody who has a number of different facilities potentially that you need to update. And so
two already registered release sites, one inside the other one with no common outside boundary.
Again, I mean, just the short answer, and we'll demo it. I'll use a couple of release sites here to set up as an example. But what you do is you go into each release site and you map that specific acreage. So if you already have that, you have 2 facility IDs already registered for your properties. One's for a release site that happens to be within another one. When you go to release site number 1 and it says that it's 50 acres, you go and you map that specific 50 acres. And once you submit that map, you go to release site number 2 that already has an ID. And if it's 1,500 acres, you go and you map that specific 1,500 acres. Don't worry about the fact that you've got that other release site within that initial that you've already mapped. You're not going to see that map on file. All you're focusing on is what are you mapping for the facility that you are on at the moment. And we'll look at this.
So just to boil it down, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. You're going to have a single facility number for a single map.
Always.
And that, just to be clear, that is inclusive of DMP pins now. That is inclusive of deer breeder release sites. They're all contained in your larger acreage release site, correct? All of those facilities now will need to be georeferenced.
Good point. So that's one thing I should have covered earlier on. The facilities that need to be mapped within the deer breeder system specifically are deer breeding pens, release sites, nursing facilities, and those are the 3 biggies. Those are the 3 that primarily make up probably 95+% of the sites that are registered in TWIMS. So again, deer breeding permitted deer breeding facilities, release sites, nursing facilities, and we have a handful of what are called medical facilities out there. We have a handful of educational and research facilities out there that would also need to put a map on file. However, DMP sites, any sites that participate in private lands permit programs, so DMP, Triple T sites, for example, those sites already have to be mapped by virtue of participating with a local biologist. Those maps are on file through LMA. So if you have a DMP facility, you don't need to worry about coming into the deer breeder side of things to map that specific area for the DMP pen. Now the release site, you do have to map. The release site is still the release site. But the DMP pen itself, you don't have to provide a map for it. That'll be done as part of the DMP permit application.
Okay, so to be clear for our folks, because a lot of us DMP, we do not need to be loading DMP maps in this software. That's done through our local biologists and a DMP permit.
That's right. So I'm logged into our other test account here, and good point of clarification. So good point of clarification, but if you have a DMP facility where you take deer and put them in a DMP holding pen, you will have a facility ID that ends in D for DMP. You do not need to provide a map for any facility ID that ends in D. But if you have a facility ID that ends in B for breeder, M for medical, N for nursing, R for release, those are the IDs that you need to go in and provide a map for. And the vast majority of folks out there will not see, most of these will not see an M and will not see an N. You've probably got a B and an R, and that's about it. So the DMP site, though, if you do have one, that's the specific, 5+ acre pen where your DMP deer go. That map will be submitted as part of your DMP application process. You don't need to worry about mapping that through the TWIMS deer breeder system. Okay.
I have another question.
Yep.
If you have a 2,000 acre registered release site, and during the course of the year or right now, you have added a 200 acre exotic pasture in that release site that has a common boundary on the, or the 200 acres has a boundary that was the outside boundary of the old release site.
So now you got an 1,800 acre high fence pasture and a 200 acre high fence pasture.
And so, but do they have to go in during the middle of the year and change those maps?
Per the regulations that were adopted as part of the comprehensive CWD rules that state that deer need to have access to the entirety of the registered release site acreage, yes, they would need to go in at that time and submit a release site amendment. So anytime a release site that's been registered changes, this is what I was talking about earlier, if you go in now to start your mapping and you see that, hey, the stated facility acreage that I put on file when I registered this thing 5 years ago is no longer accurate, either we added acreage or we sold acreage, we want you to go ahead and put on file what is the correct acreage for that release site today and map today's actual acreage for that high fenced pasture. But please submit an email to the deer.breeder address, and I'll put that in the PowerPoint here in a second. But please submit an email that explains that amendment so that our folks can put that on file for why this release site has been amended. Because that's part of the process, is that when release sites are amended, notification is provided to the department.
This is a really good question, and I want to go a little further. I can think of a couple of ranches that I know that they they may be going in right now to draw a release site,
Mm-hmm.
but they have a 200 acre segregated area for exotics or a 35 acre. They may have multiple. How do they exclude those from their map?
Okay. So we'll try to do a demonstration here, I suppose. So let me see if I can come up with kind of a scenario that we can look at as we go. So let's say that I've got a release site that's on a property that has kind of multiple high fence pastures. And let's just say it's this one with 3531R here. This is a different one of our testing accounts. Now, when we registered this for testing purposes way back when, first thing to note is we put it on file as 1 acre. And let's say we've added a lot of acres. This is now maybe a 2,000 acre ranch. The first thing I need to be thinking about, though, is that this facility ID should apply to a specific high fence pasture within that property. So if I've got a 2,000 acre place that has a 200 acre high fence pasture, a 400 acre high fence pasture, so now I've taken 600 out, and I know that the deer being released in the remaining pasture, which is also high fenced and is 1,400 acres, and I know that that's where these deer that I send to this release site go, then what I'm registering here is a 1,400 acre pasture. And I would update that information right here, but I would only go in and I would only map that specific high fence pasture that corresponds to that 1,400 acres.
I think our problem though is going to be excluding something that doesn't share a perimeter boundary. In other words, I have a 2,000 acre ranch
Mm-hmm.
and I have a 200 acre pasture inside that does not share.
It doesn't share, so it's a donut hole.
That's exactly right.
Gotcha.
And I can think of a few of those that are very isolated like that.
So I'll do a donut.
Gotcha. If we need to, let's see what we can do here with this. So let me actually quit this real quick. So I got you now. I'm with you. So let me get down to our TPWD area where I'm comfortable to draw a map in place. So there's the Austin Airport. So I'm getting close. There's the park. So we'll use the park for an example here. And let's say that the golf course that's right by maybe is a pasture that's within a pasture. And I know that the majority of the deer are running around here. And so this outside boundary represents where the deer primarily have access to. And y'all's point is that as I come around the edge here, and I keep drawing and I eventually get there and I take in all headquarters here. So I've got my 900 acres registered, but we need to cut a donut hole in this. I'm not sure that we're set up. Let's see what happens when we do this. Right. So the release sites are 1-to-1. So if I had gone in and tried to draw another pasture, it tells me, it throws this error that says you've already drawn a polygon. So delete it to draw another one. So what we have to do in this case is not trick the system, but essentially use a right of way to lollipop that in there. And so this isn't too bad to do, but what we can do is let's erase this boundary. This one doesn't work. So what I will do is begin. I will continue to show how unfamiliar I am with Max first. Bear with me. All right, so we'll start drawing our boundary. And I'm going to go along the edge of the park here. And when I get to a point where I say, hey, you know what? This is the shortest point of access along my boundary to where that interior section is, I'm going to go ahead and cut on in. And I'm just going to draw a thin line in here. And I'm going to exclude this area. And I know this isn't ideal, but what we're doing is we're going to just exclude, and we're going to say this northern half of this golf course is that hole within a hole. And I'm going to come all the way back around. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit more here. And I'm going to get right close to where I leave just that little bit. And I'm going to come and follow it right back out. And we'll talk about what it means in a second to have that little gap in between. I recognize what that means. But then I will just continue back. And so I apologize, I jumped a little bit here, but I just went back to my main exterior boundary here. And now I'm continuing to draw along. And I'm going to continue drawing my boundary. And I'll cut across, following my fence lines where I know that pasture that the deer are primarily being released in have access to. And we'll work our way all the way around now that main exterior area. And what we have when we zoom out is essentially a short right of way that runs in and says, here's our main release site with this hole in the middle. So you have to cut a dog leg in there essentially with your mapping tool And I get that this potentially makes it look like there's a small gap that these guys can't cross. What I'd encourage you to do in that case is just send a note to Deer Breeder staff, email them and say, I've got this scenario where I've got a pasture that's completely contained within a larger pasture. I drew my map in a way that makes it look like there's a small gap between the fence, but I just did that so I could get my main release site mapped. And we'll make a note for that facility that lets us know why that was drawn that way.
Is there a way to enhance the system for maybe future use where we could ask you and Mike to do more work than you're already doing? and create an icon maybe that would allow us to create a donut hole. I like that terminology if we can stick with that, but
sure,
it might just an exclusionary tool that would allow us to do an airport, for instance, or there's a lot of our guys that use airports, home facilities, things like that.
Sure.
That we're going to need to be.
And actually, we saw airport guys do that same kind of drawing right there.
Okay.
Some guys with strips. And
I appreciate you walking us through this, but if there's a way to.
Yeah, we'll work on an enhancement. There are options out there in certain tools that allow for donut hole cutting. Our understanding was that this is a pretty rare use case scenario. And so what we wanted to do is provide the functionality that takes care of the vast majority of folks. But absolutely, we will investigate donut hole creation and being able to cut out those snippets inside of an area. For now, it may be slightly clunky, but trust us, we'll understand what this is. But do send us a follow-up email.
Just to be clear, if we map a release site that has a breeder facility in it, some of our breeder facilities are substantial acreage, 50 acres, 100 acres, whatever it is. Do we need to be donut holing those?
No. And we've had plenty of that come in already where, somebody has let's say a 10, 20 acre breeding operation that's inside of a 1,000-acre pasture. Go ahead and map your pasture and then map it exactly to the fence line that to be that release pasture. And then go and you'll be on a whole separate facility ID. You won't be seeing the map that you drew for your release pasture. Just map your breeding facility. Our staff do have the ability to see where overlap occurs. That's one of the things that they're reviewing and making sure that we're not putting multiple release sites on top of one another. So, when it comes to seeing a breeding facility inside of a release site, that's understood. You may expect a call that if you're drawing that scenario where you have a 10-acre release site inside of a 500-acre release site, both have their own ID, you might get a call from permit staff for some clarification about what's going on there. What we're trying to avoid is saying that, somebody, let's say that I have a release site, Tim has a release site, you have a release site, all three of us are neighbors. What we are reviewing is to make sure that I don't draw my release site on top of yours and that I don't draw mine on top of Tim's, and therefore we've got questions about which release site boundary is actually correct. But it is understood that deer breeding facilities are often contained within a larger release site. We've seen a lot of that already, and that just gets approved. And we can see from the map viewer that we have access to, when we click on a specific boundary, what's the ID? And we can go and look at why that might be laid out in that fashion.
What's the email address again?
They need to email? It is deer.breeder@tpwd.texas.gov. And when we're almost done really with what I wanted to show for the main mapping component here. So what we'll do is we'll jump back to the PowerPoint slides in just a second, and I'll type it in on the slide.
And so the map that you have up there right now, that is not a hunting facility inside of a hunting facility.
No, this is so the example that I was trying to demonstrate here, as I understood from Patrick, is that maybe this is a 200-acre exotics pasture that's completely held within a larger release site.
Can you turn that into a release site for me on that map? Is that the same way you would do that?
No, so what we would do there, in this scenario, this map that applies to this facility ID is done. And this is all we're going to do on this page. This is facility ID 3531R. It's registered as 1,400 acres. Now notice that I only drew 550. So this could be the case where if this was the acreage that was on file, I may need to make an update, or I need to come down here and maybe I just missed my map and I need to correct my map. Let's watch what happens here. I'm going to try to submit this knowing that I'm way off on my acreage, and we'll see what happens. So notice I did not jump to my facility confirmation screen. I stayed on this facility information page. This doesn't matter what type of site you're on. What it does is it says this stated acreage of 1,400 acres right here, and the calculated acreage from the map that was drawn, which is 554, do not match. You either need to adjust the map if it was drawn incorrectly, or you need to correct the acreage that's on file, whichever one is incorrect. Again, perfection is not what's expected. So if you have 100 acres and you draw 110, you're not going to have a problem submitting that. But when we get to this kind of difference, where it's greater than 15% difference between the two, that's where we threw a flag and said, wait, something's probably not quite right on one of these two components here.
I know this is the elephant in the room, but I'm getting questions about it. Is take this donut. There are deer in that donut.
Mm-hmm.
If that is another release site,
Mm-hmm.
that is its own separate release site. Mm-hmm. Can I open the gates and let deer into the other release site by amendment through you guys, or how do I inevitably amend that if I've got two release sites right now?
So the first thing to do is make sure that both existing release sites are mapped.
Yep.
In this case, we would submit this map for 3531R. So let's go ahead and do this. I'll try to walk through this to some degree. So let's assume that my stated acreage was wrong and I need to make it match. And I'm going to go ahead and put in that I have a 550 acre release site here. And let's put this on file. We submit that. Because I was within that tolerance, it took that map, and so now that map is pending attention, and so we can move on. So we know that we've got 3531 done, and now I've got this other release site, 3750R. And it's 150 acres, and that may actually be fairly close to what we're trying to demonstrate here. Right now, if that's the case, that you have these two high fence pasture, one completely within the other, what we need you to do, first of all, is come in right now and let's draw that release site as it exists today, not with what you intend to do in the future, but with what it looks like right now. And so that would be this portion here. You know, I'm using the golf course as our hypothetical. And so I would come in and I would map what I know to be the boundary of that release site as it exists today. And theoretically, when Parks and Wildlife staff, when TPWD permit staff opens this up, now I've got 128 acres here, so I missed my mark a little bit. I need to expand this. That's a little bit outside of 15%. There's 145 acres. Now I hit my fence line just right.
I don't want to take that. I don't want to take that for granted. Can you teach people how you just amended that?
Absolutely.
That way they know how to use the tool.
So again, once you draw your initial boundary, if you find that you've got an error, or if you're in the middle of drawing and you make an error, just keep going. Once you close in your boundary, you just click this wrench icon, and all those points that you dropped become available, and you can just go and click on any point that you need to and drag it where it needs to go, and just release it and drop it there, and it recalculates your acreage on the fly as you're moving stuff around. So if you recognize that, hey, you know, maybe I need to zoom in a little more, oh, sure enough, you know, my fence corner was actually a little bit further down, you can use this button right here, just click save when you're done, and you're good to go. Okay, so now I submit this, and we're still working through your scenario here, but right now we're taking care of the initial steps. So now I've got a map on file for both of these release sites that we're talking about. The larger one that completely surrounds everything, and then, you know, the pasture within the pasture that we're talking about. So the question then is, can I open my gates up to release those deer out onto the surrounding acreage? Well, that gets into the scenario of amending release sites, right? The way the rules are written for the CWD comprehensive rules says that deer need to have acreage to the entirety of that registered release site and cannot be allowed to leave that release site without notification of the department. And so at that time, the first thing I would encourage you to do is notify permit staff that you intend to modify that release site. And that process is already in place right now. That's been in place since 2016. What you do is you send an email to the permits office staff and you explain, here's the modification that's going to take place. And permit staff have to review that and send back and say, okay, we understand. Now that we have the mapping component, what I would encourage is begin with that discussion with the permits office staff, who will then contact you back and say, we understand the amendment. That amendment is approved to move forward. At that point, they will provide instructions on going in and updating the correct release site information to say, here's what the new release site looks like. It may be the case that we have to close one of those release sites because once that fence is open, those deer need to have access to the entirety of the registered acreage. So the modification may be that one existing release site needs to be closed and the acreage of the other release site needs to be expanded to include everything.
I realize this will be a case by case basis, but not misunderstanding the new soft release rules allowing for a 6-month provision, still being kind of final tweaks being worked on. But if somebody chooses to reopen that release site at a later date, it could be a year or 2 years, whatever it is, they simply go in and it has to be a 1-to-1 and they recreate the release site.
Please don't actually recreate a release site. What we want you to do is contact permits office staff, because again, you're starting the process of amending an existing release site. That acreage that had been originally registered as a release site that you then amended to say that it's now part of a larger release site, that acreage was all rolled in. Your first thing to do is submit the amendment that says, hey, we're amending this release site now that exists that's, say, the 2,000 acres entire. And so the first thing to do is contact permits office staff and submit that request for that amendment for that release site. And then what we'll do at that point is discuss with you, okay, here's the process. Are we going to reopen the original release site and we'll make that available to map again and update that map? And you'll have to update the existing map to shrink it down for the current release site. But because this is a case by case, what I encourage is when you know that's something that's about to happen, the first step is to contact the permits office. And I think what we'll do at this point, I'll put the address up for the permits office in just a second. The only other thing I wanted to do real quick is just show you, all we've looked at so far is release sites. And so real quick, what I want to do is just show what it looks like to draw a breeding facility, which is the exact same thing, but I just want to make sure everybody's clear that there is no difference. There actually is one important difference that we'll look at. So remember, maps for release sites, maps for nursing facilities, medical facilities, it's one map, one boundary per one facility ID that matches that acreage.
Before we leave release sites, and thank you for that point. Before we leave a release site, how does a landowner turn a existing release site into a soft release?
It's a good question. First thing, it's going to be a release site amendment. And so again, we're going to ask that you contact staff, because what we need to do is address the existing facility ID for that site and determine what needs to happen to it. Does it need to be closed, for example, to say that, or does it even need to be modified? There's going to be a number of scenarios we come across where it depends on, has the surrounding acreage already been registered as its own release site, or what exactly is the case? I mean, this is a release site amendment. So the first step in these scenarios every time is to contact permits office staff, explain that particular scenario, and then we can help figure out what is the next step. Because I guarantee you, there's probably about as many different scenarios as there are people listening right now that we might come across. And so I don't have a blanket answer. It depends on what's been registered around that site, how the releases have been conducted there in the past, and that's going to drive what we need to do to get the information that's on file up to date, potentially create a new release site or modify an existing one, and then submit a soft release notification.
Before we leave that facility inside a facility, if you have that facility inside a facility, can the facility inside the other facility be like a class 3 facility, and the facility on that around that be a class 1 facility? And then if they release deer out of the smaller acreage into the large acreage, does that become?
That's a big part of why the CWD regulations were written the way they were. Where deer are released is where the release site classification pertains to. So that's one of the big issues that we're looking at here, is trying to make sure that we're tracking where does that release site class belong. So if you have a small acreage within a large acreage that you took class 2 deer into, that specific acreage is where those class 2 requirements apply to. Now, if you amend that class 2 release site to allow those deer to have access to larger acreage, that's one of the things the permits office staff need to monitor. You should be well aware that as soon as you amend that release site acreage to provide those deer to have access to larger acreage, the class 2 status goes to that new acreage as well, and those class 2 requirements apply there. Now, I realize that we are now in March of 2019, and so there's a lot of discussion about do release site testing requirements still apply? If you are a brand new release site today, and because the TC2 status does still exist for certain deer breeding facilities that haven't upgraded or haven't done the antemortem testing to upgrade, or haven't been testing at 80% for 5 years since we're only 3 years in, a brand new release site registered today might receive a class 2 designation if they took deer in transfer today or later, after March 1 of 2019. That release site would not have any CWD testing requirements go with that Class 2 status. However, we do have a number of Class 2 sites out there that have not completed all required CWD testing on that site. They still have testing moving forward into the future deer seasons until all that testing is done. And if that applies to anybody that's listening in, you should know that as you make release site amendments, those Class 2 requirements go with the release site amendment that you submit. So I just want to be real clear. If a site is done with release site testing, you still need to submit your amendments. Release site amendments need to be submitted because of how the rules are written. And if there's a Class 2 consideration, particularly one that has deer testing requirements with it, you need to be aware that that moves with that amended facility acreage. So I hope that helps. Yeah. So the last thing that I do want to demo before we just completely open up for questions, and I do finally throw up that email address for folks to copy down. There is one important difference that is in the mapping. I mean, the process is the same, but one important difference that's allowed for deer breeding facilities that we haven't covered yet. So this is the one scenario where one-to-one doesn't apply. Everything we were talking about before now was a non-breeder facility, you know, the release, the nurse, the nursing, the medical, etc. Deer breeding facilities, though, potentially do have different sets of non-contiguous pens under the same facility ID. So the first thing to note when we are registering a deer or mapping a deer breeder facility, you know, this is our test site. Again, at TPWD headquarters, our theoretical facility has 2 pens covering 8 acres. We are not asking you to, if all those pens are contiguous, we are not asking you to map individual pens. We are just asking you to put down the perimeter of where are those pens located. But we're just like what we drew for the release site. So if you have an entirely contiguous set of pens, just draw the perimeter of that facility, encompassing all the acreage that you use as part of that breeding facility, including a handling barn or whatever it is that you have included in that mapped or that stated acreage. Draw that, just draw that perimeter footprint, submit that just like we've been showing already, and you're good. Let's assume though potentially that, like we know we have out there, a number of folks who have multiple non-contiguous sets of pens that are under the same facility ID. And that only applies to deer breeding facilities. This, again, does not apply to any release site. This does not apply to any nursing facility, only to deer breeding facilities. But if that scenario applies to you, you do have the option to draw multiple non-contiguous perimeters when your facility type that you're drawing is a deer breeding facility. And so that's what we'll demonstrate here real quick.
I want to be clear for folks, this is only under the same breeder facility.
Right.
Correct. In other words, if you have a certified facility and a non-certified facility, you will need to draw 2 different facility maps under both ID, under one ID and the other under the other ID. Correct?
Yeah, good clarification. So if you have multiple permits, if you have a permit, whether it's on the same property for one set of pens and then a separate permit for another set of pens, you need to, those permits, or I should say those facilities, each have their own ID. To Patrick's point, whether that's for a certified herd that's in the Animal Health Commission program and then one that's not, or whatever the case may be, that you decided to register your 2 different deer breeding permitted facilities separately, those are separate maps. But we do have folks out there who have under a single permit, under one facility ID, a couple sets of pens where they maybe have a primary set of pens with the handling barn, and then a secondary set of pens that is disjunct, non-contiguous, completely detached and somewhere else on that same property. And in that case, we do need to map all of the acreage that is registered under that permit for that facility ID. And that is allowable here with this facility or with this mapping capability. And so what we're looking at here is the TPWD headquarters. And let's assume that my 2 pens in this scenario are actually non-contiguous. What I would do is go and map pen 1. And that's going to be here in the parking lot. Looks like I mapped it a little big, or maybe my main pen is 1.4 acres. And then I need to come over here, and let's say my separate pen is discontiguous, non-contiguous. It's over here. Once I've closed in that pen, all we did there was exactly what we've done so far. We clicked on the Draw Polygon button. We drew our fence lines. We closed in our polygon. And essentially, we've done everything we've done up to now for release sites. What I have the option to do here for breeding facilities is click this again to start another polygon. And I can come over to where my second set of pens is, and I can draw that set of pens as well. And what you'll notice is my acreage updates now to include the additional acreage that's been mapped. You keep going until you've mapped. We actually do have a few facilities out there that have even potentially 3 or maybe even in a few small cases 4 or so non-contiguous sets of pens. Whatever it is that makes up the acreage of that particular facility ID for a deer breeder facility is what you need to submit your map for. So that if pen set 1 is here and pen set 2 is here, you draw those separately, but on this same map. So this is the one big difference when we're looking at deer breeding facilities.
And there might be 10 pins in pin set 1, and there might be 10 pins in pin set 2.
Good point.
There's just one square around each one.
That's right. We're only mapping the footprint. If there were 10 individual pins within this area, there's no expectation that those individual 10 pins be mapped here. You do still have to put your plat diagram on file that shows where feed is, where water is, what the individual pin layout is. So that does not go away with this. This is just showing where on the property is that facility. And that can be important. When you've got a 10-acre deer breeding facility inside of a 10,000-acre ranch, it can be pretty difficult to find where is that 10 acres. So this is helping Parks and Wildlife staff understand where is this deer breeding facility on this location.
The other thing I'd like you to clarify is in our breeding facilities, we do need to include our handling facility, correct?
Go ahead and include that as part of the acreage. That's right. Don't count it as a pen. It is not a pen, but do show where that barn is on your diagram and basically draw a diagram that shows how that facility is laid out. And if a handling barn is present, please do incorporate and show us where into your plat. Show us where that handling barn is in relation to the facility.
The other thing I wanted to know, to just tell folks is the button that we're talking about to click again to add an additional set of pins looks like a triangle. It's a triangle tool button so that you can add it again.
It's this. So in the map help guide, you'll see the one that says click this icon to start drawing a new boundary. Every time you need to click to draw a new boundary, you click this triangle shaped icon. And so if I had a third set of pins that I needed to come and draw over here, I would click that again. Now, the same functionality, if I made a mistake on a corner of my map here and I need to edit one of these, I can go ahead and click that wrench shaped icon, and I can come and I can drag corners around or drag points around as I need to update my map appropriately. And then I click save. And once I've got my facility accurately diagrammed for all of the pins, the distinct locations of pins, not the specific pins, but where are the pins located, those perimeters, I click to submit that information. And I forgot I've got 8 acres, so I clearly drew something wrong here. I would go and make that correction, but that's the concept.
So their working facility has to be in that map.
You should include it. If you've got a spot where a breeder deer can expect to be found within a permitted facility, that should be included in your footprint, so that if a game warden showed up on site and found a tagged breeder deer in a holding room within a handling barn, it's understood that that is part of that permitted facility acreage. So yes, please do include that as part of your footprint.
The other thing I'd like you to stress is in a piece of property where they think they have a release site or a breeder facility that is 10 acres. They get onto this and they map it and it shows 15 acres and they are certain they are mapping it correctly.
Right.
I just want to be clear that we shouldn't be scared to go in and adjust the acreage if we presently believe that is, we may have just made a mistake and we included 5 extra acres. That adjusting the acreage, right. The map is what needs to be precise. Correct?
Yeah, if you know your map is accurate, you're drawing your boundary exactly as you know your fence line to exist, and it lines up that acreage is slightly off from what you put on, or is way off from what you put on originally, or have had in the past. We want you to map what is the case today, and go ahead and submit that. Now, you'll get some follow-up from staff to ask, hey, there's a change now, so can we please help us understand? And if it's simply that, this property's been in the family for generations and I've just always known it as 1,000 acres. Well, turns out it was actually 1,150 the whole time or whatever, so be it. But if it turns out that it's the case that you bought a new pasture and it got, consumed into the property, or you sold off the pasture and that update just hadn't been put on file, we want to get it correct now. And so, yes, good point. If there's something that needs to be updated, draw what you know to be accurate, and please don't adjust your map to look like what you think it should look like. Draw your map to reflect what you know to be the case on the ground to the best of your ability.
Also, staff would be contacting you because there could possibly be a mistake that you made.
Sure.
And would help you
And that's why we
Correct.
don't be scared to get contact. I mean, if that's the case and we need to go ahead and touch base, we will, and just make sure, hey, is this correct, first of all, and then second, if it is the case, what do we need? Fair enough. What do we do to get it right in TWIMS? And so if I can make this work here, finally, is that address that we've been talking about. And I guess this isn't showing just yet, so bear with me, and Patrick will have this on screen in a second. Go ahead. And you can ignore capitalization in the email address. All lowercase is just fine. And we'll have this displayed here in just a second. So for those of you who are watching online, ignore the capitalization. It doesn't matter, but that is the correct address where we've been discussing that you would send any sort of release site amendment requests to, which again, that's always the first step in the process of amending a release site, is submit a notification to that email address. Or, if you have questions about soft release, go ahead and send those questions to deer.breeder@tpwd.texas.gov. If you find yourself in that not movement qualified scenario, that you don't have enough deer in and this new regulation might apply to you, that's your first point of contact there. Our team in the permits office is phenomenal. They're there to help you, and please always know that they are your first point of contact for questions. They'll help you out.
On the georeferencing map, if your working facility or your barn or whatever is inside your georeferenced map of your breeding facility, you don't have to mark that on this georeferenced map that that's the barn.
Just include it in the main perimeter of the deer breeding facility. Correct. You don't have to do some separate distinction of what is the barn versus what are the pens. Just where, if somebody was to be at that deer breeding facility, where could we reasonably expect to find, not reasonably, where should we exactly expect to find deer within that permitted facility acreage? And if that barn is part of that, that should be included in that perimeter.
Have some questions, if you don't mind. Folks, if you have not submitted your questions at this time, please do that. We're going to get to the question and answer portion, and then we're going to go pretty fast. So the first is, how do I close a nursing facility, or how do I close a release site?
In either of those cases, please send an email stating that you need to close that site and provide the facility identification number. If you know it, if you don't, at least provide your name, and let us know that site should be closed out. Send it to that email address that's on screen, deer.breeder@tpwd.texas.gov, and we will close that site out. You will no longer receive correspondence about that site once we set it to closed.
Okay. Can an agent update a facility, or does an owner have to?
If an agent is already associated with that facility, they can do these updates. But important point, if it comes to doing the annual report, remember that the annual report is only available to the permitted deer breeder. So this is one thing I should cover. When you do your annual report this year, which we don't have available yet, again, for those of you who have a deer breeder permit, if you were to go into TWIMS right now, you could go just like we navigated to the facility information page, and you could submit your diagram or your plat, your georeferenced map boundary for your pens right now with the process we showed. If you want to hold off, if you're not worried about jumping in today, and keep in mind that you don't have to, you'll be able to continue moving deer after April 1 without putting that map on file. You just won't be able to submit your annual report until the map has been placed on file. During your annual report, this exact same, one of the things that you review as part of your annual report checklist is the facility information. That same page is there. It just has the mapping component with all of the same features we just saw. So at that time, if you're doing your annual report, you'll be able to put the map on file then. The reason I state this is that annual report is only available to permitted deer breeders, not agents. But an agent can log in now for any site they're an agent on, whether that's a breeding facility, a release site, etc., and they can put a map on file right now. So yes, agents do have access, but only through the facility page.
Okay. The next question we've already covered is, do we need to worry about mapping a deer breeding facility inside a release site? The answer is, it needs two different maps.
Exactly right. So you'll map every facility ID you have that is a release site, a deer breeding facility, nursing, etc. There should be a map on file for that.
Okay. And then this one is, do DMP pins have to be georeferenced through TWIMS? The answer is no. it needs to be done through your biologist through the LMA.
Right. So understanding that there is a DMP facility ID provided in TWIMS, all of the maps that you will do as part of your DMP application process will go through the initial application, which is done really by setting your site up in LMA appropriately with your biologist, and then you actually submit your application for DMP through the private land side of TWIMS, and you'll still provide all the normal diagrams showing, again, where the location of food, shelter, and water is. All those diagrams still apply. And so, no, you do not need to map a site that ends in D on the TWIMS deer breeder side, which applies to DMP pens.
Okay. This one is about breeder pens, breeder pen acreage. If they're going to add acreage, is it okay to add now? Even if they don't share a pen, or if they're in the process of adding on to an existing breeder pen?
Only if the high fence is complete. Keep in mind that it's required that a release site be completely enclosed by a high fence. If you have this is one scenario that we know occurs. For example, somebody buys a new piece of property, can quickly get 30 or 40 acres high fenced, and they want to get some deer release, so they do that, knowing that they ultimately plan to close the entire property in with 500 acres of high fence. And at some point, they intend to amend the release site and allow those deer to have access to that entire acreage. That's fine, but do not submit that amendment until that release site is completely high fenced. So yes, I mean, I realize I'm being wordy here, but the answer is yes if that high fenced acreage is complete and ready to be registered as a release site. Only in that case should you go ahead and submit your amendment now.
And this one says, how do you adjust your facility acreage and save it prior to mapping in order to stay within the 15% error margin? The answer is you do it all when you map now, correct?
That's right. We can jump back in if we need to, but that field was editable while you're on that screen. So you can make a change to that stated acreage while you are on the screen that you do your mapping on. So you just do both at the same time.
Yep. And so we're getting this a couple of times in here. I think there's a fear that there may be a discrepancy. Discrepancies are okay. What we're trying to do here is get the map to accurately portray your particular facility ID. So go ahead, make your map to the best of your ability, and then go into TWIMS, and then go up to that editable field that would be in yellow where you would be seeing it above the mapping tool.
That's right.
And go ahead and make sure that matches what your diagram below that you drew was.
All right. If you are confident that your map is correct, and that acreage is outside of that 15% tolerance margin, go ahead and correct that stated acreage. Like Patrick said, you just scroll up the screen a little bit where it shows all of your facility information, and you will see where you can type in a correction to the stated acreage.
Another one here is if you've already done this and you didn't include your barn, how do you go back in and fix it?
You go right back in and you go ahead and you draw another map.
Okay, so just go ahead.
Go to the ranch, right?
Just go to the deer breeding facility ID in question and submit another map.
Click the wrench.
Click the wrench.
To edit.
Yeah,
Right,
sorry. Your map will show up if it's already been approved, and you just click the wrench and you can edit it. If you don't see it yet, because it hasn't been approved or processed, you can click to draw a new boundary and go ahead and submit that correct boundary that includes that entire perimeter.
So y'all, for those of us that are listening on a cell phone or something in a truck, when they were talking about it is the wrench, WRENCH, not ranch. The wrench tool component, when you go into the TWIMS mapping system, you're going to see a couple of different icons, and the help bar that's right there will be very helpful for you. But it's the wrench on the side that you would then make adjustments to your facility.
Yeah, your Craftsman wrench. Thank you for the help there.
I know this is a little bit time consuming, but would you go back through the deadlines? We kind of rushed through them, but even if we just put up the screen.
Absolutely.
Can you walk us through the deadlines again? That way everybody gets one more talk over about what deadlines we need to know are upcoming.
Oh, great point. So most importantly, coming up and most immediately, I should say, not most importantly, they're all important. Most immediately, March 31, this Sunday, if you've got fawns that have not been tagged in your breeder pens, it's time to get out in those pens and get to work. So fawn tagging deadline is March 31 for all deer born in 2018 that are in pens. Also March 31, if you are a class 2 or 3 release site, your harvest log for your release site is due for the 2018-19 hunting season this Sunday. Again, you'll notice that your CWD tests are not due for that harvest until May 1. So if you don't have your CWD reports back yet, that's okay. But you do need to submit and complete your harvest log showing what was harvested by this Sunday, March 31. Okay, so the next day, Monday, April 1, a couple more important things come up. So your MLD reporting deadline, if you participate in MLD, is April 1. So at the very least, it's harvest that has to be reported. And if you're in conservation option, you also need to go ahead and get your habitat practices on file. That's due by this coming Monday, April 1 at midnight. On April 1, this isn't a deadline. This is when you can begin doing your annual reports for your deer breeder permit. So again, regardless of whether you have a multi-year permit or a one-year permit, everybody that has a valid deer breeder permit needs to complete an annual report or submit a closure notification. And if you are due up for a renewal, you need to go ahead and submit your renewal with your $200 or whatever the fee for the multi-year permit of your choice is. So that starts April 1, not due until May 15th. Final thing, of course, for April 1 is primarily what we've been here to talk about today. The georeferenced map requirement really is implemented on April 1 for those non-breeder facility types. So if you have a release site, a nursing facility, etc., that does not have a map on file as of April 1, you will not be eligible to activate a transfer permit to that site until the map is on file. The important point there being, if you have a transfer that you know is coming up in the next few weeks, you want to jump in now and get your map done. But if you know you don't intend to release deer until the fall, you are not so worried about April 1 right now. You do want to get in, and I'm not telling you to put this off, but I'm telling you, you don't need to be in hurry mode right now either. You've got time to get it done if you don't have a upcoming release. But if you do intend to send deer to a release site in the next few weeks, get in touch with your customer. If you have a release of your own planned, get that map on file by April 1. May 1 is our next date. Class 2 and 3 release sites that submitted that harvest log by this coming Sunday, by May 1, you need to get your CWD reports on file for that harvest. And then finally, May 15th, as always, that's when your deer breeder annual report is due. So those are important dates for the next month and a half.
I'm just going through some more of the questions. On soft release provisions, we just want to be clear that we are now going through a new soft release requirement that a regulation that will allow us a 6-month provision.
That's correct.
Those are already open, even though we don't have finalized the finalized documented language is not quite online yet. We're still allowing that provision. So
correct.
My question, one of the questions is, how do we go about notifying it? And I think it's as easy as submitting the form.
Yep. So if you could move me back over, let's move into internet browser,
back to Chrome.
And let's go ahead and move over to our website. I want to just go ahead and open up a new tab if that's all right. Sure. And let's go. I'll get a web page up for us here in just a second, folks.
There you go. So Texas.gov.
There it is. Oops. Me and Macs. We'll get there, y'all. This is what it looks like when somebody doesn't use a Mac every day, gets put in front of a Mac. So if you're on the TPWD homepage and you want to look for information about soft releases, the easiest thing to do is to click on our wildlife tab, click on permits, and you'll see that there's the deer breeder program link down here. So you're just 2 clicks in at this point. Click on deer breeder program. And we've got a bit of information. So all your access to rules and regulations is available. Links to TWIMS and TWIMS instructions are available. And then down here we have forms. And one of the forms is this soft release request form. If you click on this, it gives you information about how to fill it out. Nothing is changing about this form. So again, a soft release pen does not need its own release site ID. It is understood that a soft release pen is held within a larger release site, and that any deer temporarily held in that soft release pen will be allowed out onto that larger release site that is registered with its facility ID by whatever the appropriate release date is that applies to that soft release pen, which is now the 10-day cutoff or earlier between March 1 and the 10-day cutoff. So what you do is you make sure that your site is registered. You fill out this information here. The permittee name is the source of the deer. So where are you taking deer from? Where are they going to? And what is the information about the pen? Because again, this is a captive holding pen. So likely it's not capable of supporting the number of deer that'll be in there without supplemental feed and water. And so it's required that we go ahead and say how many deer are going in here. Can it actually hold deer? Are all the things that need to be in place to hold deer in captivity there? And then it is required that you provide a diagram that shows where is feed and water, so that we have that on file stating that we know that those deer will be cared for while they're in that pen.
Trying to better understand this, we had a question come up that we realized that they need to be out of the soft release pen 10 days prior to the hunting season, just like it would be a transfer of deer.
That's right.
But when can you start putting them in there? A lot of times we move does in the fall. Can you move them in there? Can you move antlerless into the pen after the release date?
No, so as I understand the provision, and I'll ask anybody that may know better to correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, the soft release provision says that deer can only be placed in the soft release pen now during a closed season for deer. So that means that between the 10-day cutoff and the end of February, when it's open deer season, no deer can go into a soft release pen. So we're talking about being able to use a soft release pen now from March 1 of a given year until the next 10-day cutoff arrives, which is always mid-September, whatever the 10 days before that actual start of season are. So great point, but no, you cannot put deer into a soft release pen during an open deer season now. Okay. That is one change that came with this adoption.
Okay. The other is both commingling of susceptible species in a soft release pen and commingling of any species. In other words, it is my understanding that we cannot commingle CWD susceptible species in a soft release pen with whitetail deer. So if I had Sika and I had whitetail, I cannot put them in a soft release pen. But if I have a soft release pen that has a black buck in there with whitetail, that is permitted. Can you explain what the provisions will be?
That's a great question, and I'm going to be a little careful on this one. Particularly for those folks who participate in a Texas Animal Health Commission program, I don't want to speak out of turn here about what requirements may be on sites that are registered for THC susceptible species. So what I think I should do in this case is provide you with an answer. I'll get you an answer and email it to you, but I'm not going to go out and say something wrong here while we're online. So let me check into that for you, and I'll get you an answer that you can share with your membership.
Sure. And I think one of our things is some of these what we would call acclimation pens are also used for exotics. Right. We want to know what can you commingle with whitetail deer during that 6 months and what can you not, so that we don't get people in trouble.
Absolutely. We'll get you an answer for that, but I want to make sure we get it right.
Sure. We're going to go back to some questions, folks. We talked about a little bit about this, but if there's an easy way just to give an overview, how do you save your maps from the LMA site as a KML file?
Absolutely.
Do you want to go back into the site, or is there an easy way to just talk somebody through saving it in the LMA as a KML file?
Yeah, great point. Let's have a look. Let's see. I think we're actually still in. Yep, we're in the internet, and everybody's seeing this. Oops, let me just do this. This should search. Here it is. Bear with me just a second, folks. So we will go exactly through this process. And this is a good question. There is one small trick to getting your KML. It's easy to get out of the system, but then there's one small trick that you have to do to use the file to upload into the system here. Let's see what is. And so what we've got here are all of my test sites that I have, and this is the one that I keep, so I'm logged in as if I was a customer. And so we'll go to one of my properties that's mapped. And you see I tend to stick around our area here. When you are on your main property information page in LMA, if you go down below the map, there's an option to download as KML. All you have to do is click that button, and it'll immediately start the download on a PC. It asks you, do you want to open it or save it? What I want to do is go ahead and open this file. Looks like we don't have Google Earth potentially on this machine. If you have Google Earth, you can go ahead and open it. And so I guess I won't be able to fully demonstrate this now, but this file has already been downloaded to this computer, and you can save it in your documents or on your desktop, wherever you can find it. The one trick is when you download a file or your KML, it downloads all of the different boundary maps that exist. And so what we have here is the main property map that exists to show this test property boundary. And then this is set up to have 2 management units. So for those of you folks out there familiar with LMA, you map all the different units on your property, the high fence units where you are participating in MLDP. And so for a number of folks, they may have more than one management unit. If you don't, you have a map that just demonstrates the boundary of that matches your main property boundary. When I click download, in this case, all 3 maps are going to come out. The one that matches the main property, and then the maps that match each of these management units. And so my assumption is that if these are differently high fence pastures here and you have multiple management units, then you need to go ahead and open up Google Earth and save the KML that matches this specific pasture. And it comes out for you, it's there. But you need to go ahead and go into Google Earth and say, this is the one I want, save that to your computer, and then you can upload that directly into Google Earth. Likewise, even if this had a single management unit, you get 2 maps out. You get the main property and then the overlaying management unit that happens to match. You still want to go on Google Earth and just save one of those boundaries that matches that perimeter. Otherwise, it's going to try to double your acreage. So if you download your file and you find that it seems to be doubling your acreage, open that KML in Google Earth, and on the left-hand side of Google Earth, you'll see where you can look at the individual layers that make up that map, and you can save the specific KML you want.
Good. And then it's pretty simple. You go back into TWIMS for your facility ID.
Yep.
And there's a little file folder on the left of the map. You hit the little file folder, and again, then you would just go to your browser, wherever you saved that document, desktop, wherever it was, and you'd be ready to go.
That's right. And so if we were in here, just to show exactly what Patrick's talking about, if you have a file available, whether it's for your breeder facility, whether it's for your release site, what we have primarily focused on are the drawing tools to allow you to draw within the system. But this button right here is a upload tool, and it will open a file browser so that you can find whatever you have saved to your computer. And so when you hover over it, it says if you want to load a file, GPX or KML, KML is primarily what folks are using. That's where you go to do that.
Okay. Dive back in here just to make sure we got all of the questions answered. Folks, bear with us. Make sure we get this one. Y'all, this is a pretty simple question, but again, I want to be real clear that we answered this correctly now. Says, if I have a 1,000-acre ranch and it is divided into 4 pastures separated by 7-foot fences or higher, do I need 4 different release sites? The answer from now on is each pasture needs its own facility ID and will then have its own corresponding map to be drawn. Correct. So you will not draw 2 maps in one mapping system unless you are in the deer breeder portion of the breeder facility portion of this system. So if you are dealing with a release site, if you have multiple release sites, you will have to have 1 map per each release site ID.
Correct, exactly right.
Is there a way to use a soft release facility as a DMP facility at a DMP facility or vice versa?
I guess I'm not quite sure that, or I want to make sure that I get this question right. So soft release used as DMP or vice versa. If a pen is currently permitted under the authority of a deer management permit, it can only be used for that purpose. So if you have an active DMP permit on a pen that's on the property, that is all that pen can be used for. That said, if you do not have an active pen and it is not part of any other permit, and that pen therefore is not part of any sort of other authority, potentially it can be used as a soft release pen. But what I would encourage you to do in that case, if you have a pen that you plan to use possibly for multiple different purposes, soft release, DMP, or if you are considering adding it as a deer breeder pen at some point, before you do anything, I would encourage you to contact the permits office and make sure that you understand and they understand exactly what's going on. What we don't want you to do is wind up with conflicting authorities on the same pen, because that would be a problem. A pen can only be used for one purpose at a time. And so we don't want you to wind up in a scenario where there's confusion you have an active DMP permit, and you submit a soft release request, that would not jive. That would cause problems. So be careful. The answer is potentially, but you need to make sure your specific scenario is well understood with permit staff and that you guys are on the same page about what you're trying to do there.
Last question that we have is there a minimum acreage for a release site or a soft release pen?
The answer is no. There is in statute or neither in statute or regulation is there any minimum acreage specified for a pen, whether it's to be registered as a release site or used as a soft release pen.
Okay. Tim, thanks for helping setting this up. Chris, thank you for helping set this up. Y'all, we've gotten through all of the questions. We will be posting this again for your review. If you have any questions further, we're going to take you back here and we're going to direct you to deer.breeder@tpwd.texas.gov. So please, again, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to your permit staff or use the email enclosed in this presentation. Either will get you the answer that you're looking for. And folks, please, I'd like to stress again, don't wait till April 1st to get your maps done. While this is fresh on your mind, get in the TWIM system today and go ahead and create your maps to the best of your ability. That way, if you run into a kink or there's not something quite right, you're not waiting till the deadline to get it done. That alleviates both problems on your end for trying to get your annual reports or your reporting done, and it also allows Parks and Wildlife staff to focus on the real emergencies that are happening on these deadlines. So again, do your maps today, do your maps tomorrow while it's fresh on your mind and you're utilizing the information that Chris just provided. And unless y'all have anything else, y'all, we're going to wrap it up, try to get this thing online just as soon as possible.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Appreciate the chance to be here.